welcome. And without more ado, I will begin by, as usual, lighting the Temenos candle. We'll have a moment of quietness and, if you like, contemplation, and then I will introduce tonight's speaker. So, many of you know, and some of you may not know, we always light this candle at the beginning of Temenos events to commemorate Dr. Kathleen Vane, our founder, who used to say it's better to light a candle than to curse the dark. So we hope that we're going to be able to bring a little bit of light to everybody. And tonight in particular, it's a great delight to introduce our speaker, Professor Patrick Curry. About a year ago, I happened to read this book of Patrick's called Enchantment. Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life. I found it an absolute delight to read. It was a pleasure in itself. It was also deeply illuminating and extremely thought-provoking. I followed it with this second book on a related theme, Art and Enchantment, How Wonder Works. It may seem paradoxical that somebody can be writing books about wonder, but I can tell you that Patrick has done so in exemplary and deeply stimulating fashion. They are splendid books, and I really do commend them to you. I'm reading the first of them for a second time at the moment and immensely enjoying it. They are very fine and very thought-provoking books. Patrick Curry was born in Canada. He has a doctorate in the history and philosophy of science from University College London, and he has lectured widely. He's been a lecturer at the University of Kent and at Bath Spa University. He is a tutor at the University of Wales, Trinity St Davis, and his many books include one of the pioneering advocacies of J.R.R. Tolkien, Defending Middle-earth, Tolkien, Myth and Modernity. He has also written Ecological Ethics, an Introduction, which is now in a second edition. And he is editor-in-chief of an online journal, The Ecological Citizen. He's also a companion of Ruskin's Guild of St. George, a many-faceted writer. Patrick is a poet, and I would say also a philosopher. His work on enchantment is delightful, and though I'm sure Patrick will argue with me for saying this, I find it in itself at certain moments enchanting. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Patrick Curry to speak to us on art and enchantment. Patrick.
Well, thank you very much. It's going to be hard to live up to that. Thank you, Greville, and it's an honor to be here. Grateful for the invitation and the opportunity. I'm going to speak for about 55 minutes. I'll try to avoid an undignified scrabble towards the end where I try to get everything in that I've left out. And in order to leave, say, 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So my focus is both tonight and in my books, the experience of wonder that is at the heart of what I'm calling enchantment. Now, this experience has low, medium, and high intensities. The low intensity is charm. Isn't this person charming? Isn't this a charming situation? Then it sharpens and deepens, can sharpen and deepen into delight. And finally, most rarely of the three, there's full-blown joy, which of course, doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, it can be life-changing. I always feel that given the world as it currently is, and the situation that we're in globally in various respects, that it's a question could be asked: is it not frivolous to be concerned with something like this? I don't think so. I would take my lead from a couple of authorities on the subject. One of them is J.R.R. Tolkien. His word for enchantment was fairy, and he said in one of his letters, "Fairy is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life." Now, this is a man who survived the Battle of the Somme, so he couldn't be accused of being unrealistic. Along the same lines, the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz said, "It's madness to live without joy." And he was writing in 1945 in the ruins of Warsaw. So I take some encouragement from that. So what enchants? Well, in theory, anything can enchant, but because there is such a thing as human nature, and we are particular kinds of beings, there's commonalities, and enchantment tends to show up in certain contexts more than others. Contexts that it does tend to show up in include classically love, falling in love. I almost want to say archetypally so, but also other kinds of human relationships, parent-child relationships, friendships, and so on. It happens a lot in contexts of the natural world, either other natural beings, animals that you might connect with, as it were, and realize that you're looking at this whale, say, and the whale is looking back at you. And places, natural places, very powerful. This needn't be a spectacular rainforest, could be just a little corner of woodland, a particular stream, a grove of trees, and so on. Food and drink, a very underestimated source of enchantment in all our lives. Learning, that is to say, when the learning is for its own sake, and the pleasure of learning something new, rather than anything you plan to use it for or do with it. Religion, very powerful source of enchantment and religious ritual, which I think I might come back to. And certainly art. Now, later on, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some idea of the general characteristics and dynamics of enchantment. Then I'm going to talk specifically about how those work out in relation to art. And when I get to that point, I'll give you some examples of experiences of enchantment in art. But just briefly to get started, I'm sure so my book, my second book addresses painting, fiction, and music. I'm sure these sorts of experiences are not all that unusual. I recall looking at a painting, a Chinese landscape painting, quite an old one, in a gallery in Paris. And I have a temperamental connection with Chinese landscape art. And I stood there for what must have been a long time looking at this painting. And I had the very strange sensation of being at one and the same time in the painting, standing on the hill next to these trees, looking at the distant mountains, and simultaneously being in a gallery in Paris, looking at the painting as a whole. I was in both places at once, and I looked for a long time, and as I was looking, other people came up to look at the painting, and they seemed to be speeded up, you know, they like a film speeded up. Meanwhile, the painting and I were just communing, taking our time. Music, very powerful enchantment possible with music. Usually takes the form of being swept away. It has, in my case, being carried off by, say, the oboe solo of this particular folk tune or whatever. And yet somehow, when I think about it, carried away, but also perhaps carried deeper into where I already am when I'm listening to the music in that particular place, in that particular room, in that setting. With literature, it's something along the lines of this, which has also happened to me, and I'm sure perhaps to some of you. Reading a book, I think it was Peer Gynt when I was a teenager, and being absolutely gripped because I had to continue reading in order to find out what happened to me next. I was Peer, and Peer was me. Of course, that doesn't mean that I stopped being Patrick, but I was also Peer. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of experience I'm talking about. Right. The etymology of the word enchantment is interesting. I don't put all the weight on it, but it comes from the old French en, to be in, chantement, singing, originally from Latin, of course. So it means literally to be in a song, or in the singing that you're hearing, or to find yourself in the song that you are singing, perhaps. And by extension, I think in any narrative. And a painting can tell a story. Obviously, literature usually tells a story. So you find yourself in the story that you're listening to, or looking at, or reading. And that kind of experience is already, you see, metaphorical. It's metaphor because Patrick remains Patrick, but he also is Peer. Peer remains Peer, but he's also Patrick. So logically speaking, this is deeply offensive. In terms of Aristotelian classical logic, you have to be either one or the other, and there is no third thing. But that's not what happens. And with all due respect to the logicians, that's not only not what happens in enchantment, I think it's not how we live. So when I say that metaphor is central to enchantment, I don't mean I don't even mean epistemological metaphor in the sense of, oh, that's how we know something. I mean that it's with our being, the way we actually are, experience ourselves as lots of things, and we don't stop being ourselves at the same time. The classical example is Achilles is a lion, exclamation mark. Now the exclamation mark's important because you've just realized something very important about Achilles to do with his essential. I mean, Achilles is rather like a lion in certain respects that we can define. No, I'm not saying that. He is a lion in certain respects that are absolutely essential to his nature. He doesn't stop being a man, and a lion doesn't stop being a lion, but at the same time, Achilles is a lion. And that's a classic example of metaphor, which happens in enchantment quite a lot. Falling in love, I mentioned, the person you fall in love with may present themselves to you as a god or a goddess. It's very important to, on the one hand, acknowledge that, yes, that is happening, and on the other hand, not forget that they're also a human being. If you just stick with the human and deny the other aspect, you're closing off what the situation or the person has to tell you, what you have to learn from this. If you just stick with the divinity, you're really asking for trouble, because sooner or later the human will reassert itself, of course. So metaphor. So it's participatory, what I'm talking about. If you're standing outside enchantment looking on at it, it hasn't worked. you're not really getting it. If you have to be, you find yourself participating in the enchantment before you know what's happening. Okay. Now there comes a certain point very early on in the experience of enchantment where you can go, no, I don't want this. I'm not going to do this. But enchantment is fateful. It's because it's so personal. It's personally, it feels, and therefore we may take it is personally directed at you in some intense way. So that moment is fateful, and if you deny it, if you choose to deny it, you will be marked fatefully as having denied that moment of enchantment. Whether you accede to it or whether you deny it, fate will have is having its say. Okay, and that's part what I mean by participatory. No one is in control with enchantment. There's this image, very common image of casting a spell. Somebody's enchanted. Oh, they've had a spell cast on them. This is a particular fear, I think, may even be a particularly male fear of losing control, of being at the mercy of somebody else or something else that's casting a spell and has rearranged your state of consciousness, and you might not know what you're doing, etc. There may well be such a thing, but that's not what enchantment is. If anything, enchantment is the opposite. It's the breaking of a spell. Enchantment breaks the spell of disenchantment, of ordinariness, of boringness, of everything is the sameness. It breaks that spell, and which is why it's associated with a feeling of waking up and freshness and aliveness. It's really an experience of feeling alive and appreciating that you are alive. Okay. I've said it's always personal. It's always relational. In other words, it's always you're in wonder at something or someone. You're enchanted by someone or something. So it's not just a state of mind, which then looks around for something to be enchanted by. It's relational from the very beginning, okay? And as it increases in intensity, I mentioned at the beginning there was intensities, the other becomes a subject. The more and the relationship becomes more and more reciprocal, the more intense it is. The classic example, I think, of that might be Rilke's experience of the torso of Apollo in Paris in the museum, which concludes with the torso of Apollo, which, let's remember, technically speaking, is not an organism, a living object in that technical sense. Nonetheless, the torso of Apollo says to him, "Here is no place that does not see you. You must change your life." So it's speaking to him, okay? And so what we find is, I would recommend, let's just forget about what's technically possible and not, and certainly what is technically alive and not. All sorts of things can come to life in enchantment if they're enchanting you or you're enchanted by them. And partly as a result of, so the aliveness of the other is partly created by you, perhaps in some sense, but also you're discovering an aliveness that was already potentially there. Really stupid question to ask. Am I making this happen, or am I discovering a truth? Well, the only possible answer is both, or neither alone. But since it's relational, there's no stable essences involved. Things keep changing all the time, and nobody's in charge. See? Nobody's in charge of enchantment. Nobody's doing it to anybody else, not unless they're being done to as well, in any case. So in that sense, enchantment is wild, and that gives it an elective affinity with the natural world, which, when it hasn't been commodified, carved up and sold off, is also wild. Nobody's in charge of it. Nobody's running it or making it happen. So there is an elective affinity between enchantment and nature. that I can't go into now. It also follows that enchantment can't be controlled completely or managed. It certainly can't be created on demand. There is something that pound in industries of spin and advertising can create on demand and do, which I call glamour, which is very like enchantment, but it's a fake. It's a fake enchantment, which is being put to service, put to work for somebody's benefit. Very different thing in the end. What you can do is you can encourage enchantment. You can create the conditions that it favors. And you can resolve to stay open to it if it happens and see what there is to be learned and so on. You can even resolve to work with it, provided you're not putting it to work in your service. So Max Weber, who knew a thing or two about enchantment, called it concrete magic. Concrete magic. And what he meant by that was that enchantment is simultaneously very precisely delineated, embedded, embodied in certain precise, specific set of circumstances, including yourself, your body, your mind, the place it's happening in, the moment it's happening in, and completely spiritual, completely, ineffably deep and ungraspable, and spiritual in the proper sense of the word. It's both of these things. And so that makes it, as it were, it's an experience that is upstream of this split that we've been trained over hundreds and thousands of years to make, this set of binary distinctions. Oh, is it spiritual or is this material? Is this subjective or is this objective? Is this real or is this fantasy? And so on and so on. It's upstream of all that. It just ignores all that as if it was unimportant, which in a very real sense it is. And a weapon of disenchantment is to ask these questions. Okay, it's a weapon of disenchantment. It takes place in a moment, what the artist Etel Adnan called short but deep moments, and a place, not time and not space, but a moment and a place. It's imminent, so it feels like a transcendent experience, but the transcendence comes about as a result of going more deeply into where you are and what's happening, okay? So it's a sort of imminent transcendence. To quote one novelist, John Crowley, the farther in you go, the bigger it gets. Time often almost stops, can slow right down, but it doesn't stop completely because because of the concrete part of the equation, so to speak, changes still keep happening. So in that sense, enchantment is already passing from the moment you experience it. And it's possible to have this peculiar emotion I call preemptive nostalgia, summed up by a haiku, I think, by Basho, which can be translated as, even in Kyoto, when I hear the cuckoo, I long for Kyoto. Because that Kyoto is already passing. So the best attitude to have is, I like this phrase by Freya Stark, the great English travel writer, fearless receptivity. Now the contrast is with disenchantment. I don't want to spend too long on disenchantment. There's a normal, ordinary disenchantment. It's Monday morning, let's say, 8:30 in the morning. I've got a lot of things to do. Nothing wrong with that as such. There's a kind of, I believe, a natural disenchantment in certain places, parts of the world to do with the natural world. There are some are very enchanting and some are very disenchanting. However, there is a third kind of disenchantment, which is programmatic. And it's a deliberate attempt to disenchant the world by what I call, borrowing the term from somebody else, the mega machine. Why would the mega machine want to disenchant the world? Because if you have no, so let me start again. Enchantment is an intensely meaningful experience. It's an experience of meaning. If you have none of that, or as little as possible in your life, to, as it were, root yourself in, no ground on which you can stand and say, sorry, this is ultimate for me, and therefore it's not for sale. And that suits the mega machine very well, because then it turns you into consumers who are ruled by instrumental logic, whose only relevant question left to you is, how much is it worth and what can I use it for? Okay. Enchantment is the very antithesis of that. And I'll mention this because I think it may turn out to be important later. This mode of disenchantment tends to have two kinds. One I call Dionysian. And so Dionysian disenchantment is total, overwhelming, orgasmic unity. All boundaries disappear, in which case there's nobody left to have an experience of enchantment. When you're enchanted, no matter how intensely you're enchanted, boundaries still stay in place. Just they become relativized, okay, or porous, but they don't cease to exist. If there's nobody there, how can you have a relationship with somebody else? They don't exist and you don't exist. No enchantment. And I call Apollonian. Apollonian you take the other, whoever the other is or whatever it is, and turn it into an object. You are the only subject. The other is an object. It becomes an I-it relationship completely, so that you can control the other, manipulate them, exploit them, do whatever you want with them. Ethics don't apply because they're only an object. Okay? That's deeply disenchanting as well. I'll come back to that. Right, now, how are we doing? Yes, boundaries still exist. Oh yes, play, I'll mention play. Enchantment has a deep affinity with true play. That is to say, play where you don't already know the outcome, okay? And play is always metaphorical, even with a non-human animal. If two dogs are playing, pretend fighting, on the one hand, they have to really convincingly look like they're fighting and they're going to bite each other. But if they really start doing that, then they're not playing anymore. They're having a fight. So the message of each dog is, I'm biting you, but I'm not really biting you. So, I mean, you know, dogs can do it. We do it all the time. We play all the time, and that play is enchanting, okay? As I said, it can be encouraged and welcomed. And I think there's a lot to be said for the idea of Paul Ricoeur that when we have been through the disillusionment of adulthood and maturity to a certain point, the agenda becomes recovering a sense of wonder, the sense of wonder that we had as a child, but recovering it in a new way, of course, a much more seasoned sort of way, what he called second naivete. And in this respect, also in the respect of staying open to it and resolving to work with it, the will has something to do. I mean, the will is essentially the opposite of enchantment. There's no will happening in enchantment, but there is something will can do in the service of enchantment, can do these things. And that's a good use of the will, as opposed to, say, domination, exploitation, manipulation, etc. Right, art. Well, let me just say that I was finishing the book on art and enchantment when I came upon this extraordinary description in a Harper's Magazine, American, very good American magazine, quoting a critic, a leading critic, commenting on an artist. And what the critic said was, quote, well, you don't have to read Lacan to appreciate this work, But Lacan is helpful if you want to take the work in without miring yourself in direct frontal relation to what it's saying at the moment you're looking at it. Isn't that extraordinary? Heaven forbid we should actually listen to what the work is saying at the moment that you're looking at it. Well, here's a way to protect yourself with theory. Well, this is the very opposite of what I want to do. All the theory, and there's a lot of it in my books, is in the service of understanding and honoring enchantment, not protecting yourself, okay? And of course, what's striking about this is the fear of direct encounter with art. And I suppose really the fear of direct encounter with life, okay? Here is another Apollonian enemy, theoretical enemy, the Deputy Chief Executive of Arts. You have to imagine a whole bunch of capital letters here, and Culture for the Arts Council in England a few years ago, declaring, quote, relevance is becoming the new litmus test. It will be no longer enough to produce high quality work. You will need to demonstrate that you are also facing builders and communities in ways that they value. Trying to imagine how I could face somebody in a way they would value. But anyway, yeah, so that is an enemy of enchantment, artistic enchantment. Dionysian enemies, well, hyper-technologically enabled, mass-produced, marketed and consumed art for profit. Full of what somebody called emotion without feeling, particularly, I think, obviously, in the music industry, okay? But certainly as part of a wing of the culture industry with a £1 billion budget and an eye for returns on its investment. So, right. Oh, I should say that that enchantment is not the only reason to value art. There are important experiences of art that have nothing to do with enchantment. We can't let enchantment become everything and anything. It's really important to preserve its distinctiveness. And there you can be thrilled by art, excited, you can be motivated, etc. in ways, as I say, that have nothing to do with enchantment. And here's my list, my personal list of great art that is not enchanting. Okay. Picasso's Guernica, Jimi Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner. If you've never heard it, you should. You can hear the machine guns and the bombs. It's extraordinary. Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Brecht's The Threepenny Opera, Dylan's early anti-war songs. These are all great art, and they have nothing to do with enchantment, and that's perfectly all right. Now, let me give you some examples of enchantment at work. So this is about experience I had with a painting of Ivan Hitchens. On September the 14th, 2019, I took a day trip from London to Chichester to see an exhibition of paintings by Hitchens. I had a persistent feeling, which I couldn't explain rationally, that there was something waiting for me there. And sure enough, as I turned the corner into one of the rooms, there it was, Iron Bridge over the Rother. It reached out and pulled me in, even while I remained in a room in a provincial but excellent art gallery. Time instantly slowed and tears started. So what happened? Surely the artist had imaginatively apprehended the meaning and depth of that place and had the will and the skill to present it to us transformed into what it could be. So the viewer then, I think, engages in this, when you really apprehend the painting, when you really get it, engages in exactly the same process in relation to the work of art. And that takes the viewer into the painting at the same moment and place that the artist was in when he was painting it. Afterwards, I was aware of not being quite the same person I had been before. Add the distinct feeling of being called to that gallery by the painting, and the radical enchantment is evident. I can't explain that, but isn't explanation so much whistling in the dark anyway, as Nietzsche saw? That's one of painting. Here's one of music. Not mine. I'm quoting somebody else. The pianist Jeremy Denk was wrestling with how to play a piece of music by Charles Ives, and he wasn't getting anywhere. One afternoon, quote, the violinist of the group and I were driving off campus and happened to cross the Connecticut River. Looking out of the window, he said, "You should play it like that." From the bridge, the river seemed impossibly wide, and instead of a single current, there seemed to be a million intersecting currents, urgent and lazy rivers within the river, magical pockets of no motion at all. The late afternoon light colored the water pink and orange and gold. It was the most beautiful, patient, meandering multiplicity, and instantly I knew how to play the piece. By the way, the mythic lining or provenance of enchantment in classical Greek mythological terms is Aphrodite and Hermes. Pink, orange, and gold are Aphrodite's colors, which of course you wouldn't have probably known that, but it's just an interesting aside. Thirdly, writing. This is a situation where I'm going to read you a very short paragraph by the writer Bruno Schulz, which illustrates what I mean when I say that metaphor isn't just literary, although it comes from a book, what I'm going to read you. It's to do with who we are and how we are. The girls sat perfectly still. The lamp smoked. The piece of material under the needle of the sewing machine had long since slipped to the floor, and the machine ran empty, stitching only the black, starless cloth, unwinding from the veil of winter darkness outside the window. So the cloth is the night, that's the cloth that's being stitched in the scene and in metaphor as it works in art, in literary art. Right, concrete poetry, concrete magic, let me come back to that for a minute. Here's the Irish poet Michael Longley. When you capture something with precision, concrete, you also release its mysterious aura, magic. You don't get the mystery without the precision. Perfect example of what I'm trying to say. If there's no precision, there's no mystery, and then with that, no chance of enchantment. But at the same time, what enchants is not formally identical with the precise words, images, or notes, because if it was, every time you read those words or heard those notes, you would experience the same enchantment, and that doesn't happen. On the other hand, the enchantment is inseparable from them, just as they were on that particular occasion. It was that movement of the fourth Brandenburg Concerto, just as that group, band, whatever, the English consort, as it was then, played it in that evening's slanting light in Holland Park, interspersed with that blackbird's song, no other blackbird's song, which transported me. Never before like that, and never again. Like other kinds of enchantment, artistic enchantment is relational, an encounter between the person apprehending the work of art and the artifact itself, tending to reciprocity. I've already mentioned Rilke's statue of Apollo. And along the same lines, art is not about representing the world, and it's not about not representing the world. It's about presence. When art enchants, it's present to you, and it is the artist has succeeded in adding something to the world that already exists, alongside everything that already exists. Okay, it's all about presence. I learned this from Middlemarch by George Eliot, when somebody asked this young man who's in love with a woman, somebody says, well, what is it about her that you like so much? He says, it's not a question of attributes. It's a question of her presence. And I thought, that's exactly right. Yeah. Here's a passage I like by a very out of date and unfashionable theorist of art called Victor Zuckerkandl. It's not because music expresses psychological experiences that we recognize in it the voice of our within, but because music brings to expression the mode of existence of the world that is of the same nature as my within. I know that's dense, I agree. But what I think he's really saying is everything, including you, has an inside as well as an outside. And when what your inside connects with, metaphor, meeting over a bridge of differences, connects with the inside of the artwork or the other person or the tree or whatever, then there is that experience of enchantment, there is that moment of wonder, okay? So I want to stress that it's not about just a psychological state or a condition of the world. It's not reducible to neurophysiology. It's not reducible to psychology. It's both of these and neither of them only alone. Yeah, doing okay. Here's a quote. Now I suggested, maybe you didn't catch it, or I touched on the idea that with deep apprehension of a work of art, it puts the viewer, listener, or reader in the same metaphorical place and moment as the creator or co-creator of that work of art. Here's a quote from The Lord of the Rings about Frodo's experience of Lorien, which is the heart of elvendom, in other words, enchantment in Middle-earth. It's, quote, "It seemed to him he had stepped over a bridge of time into a corner of the elder days and was now walking in a world that didn't exist any longer." But it does for him at that moment, even though it's gone. Frodo stood still, hearing far off great seas upon beaches that had long ago been washed away, and seabirds crying whose race had already perished from the earth. Enchantment does very strange things to time, particularly linear time, which it can rearrange dramatically or simply ignore. So artistic creation is a part, let's say, of natural creation. And in this sense, these are big statements, I know, I'm sorry, but I want to say art, like all culture, is rooted in nature and partakes of nature. Now, I think I have a lot here on what I call modernism. Draw a distinction between modern and modernist. We're all modern because we're all alive now. Modernism is an ideology, a commitment, a determination to be modern or be more modern, all right? It's inherently disenchanting. And I don't think I want to go into and verse on that. Just to say modernity, is a sensibility, or sometimes can be an ideology. Its sensibility is revolutionary, okay, oriented to an image of the future, which is then trying to bring everything else into line with and head in the right direction. Personally, I don't think art has a direction. I don't see how there can be an avant-garde when it's not going anywhere in particular. An avant-garde, by definition, knows where it's going in advance, And you are supposed to listen to this and go, oh, right, okay, yes, sir. I don't think so. Modern artists would include, I think, artists like Debussy, Matisse, Barbara Hepworth, David Hockney, Joseph Conrad, Wallace Stevens. They're all willing to experiment with traditional values and techniques and so on, more than say, well, this is maybe not true. I was going to say more than maybe perhaps Renaissance artists were. I have no idea. But they're willing to experiment anyway up to a point. But they're honoring the tradition that they're experimenting with and extending it. A more modernist approach is to just want to destroy the tradition and replace it with an entirely new one, year zero from here on, okay? So examples of modernist artists would include Arnold Schoenberg, Marcel Duchamp, who I actually describe as an evil genius, who set out to deliberately destroy not just the enchantment of art, but art as such. John Cage, his student, James Joyce, possibly Ezra Pound. In jazz, John Coltrane, as against, say, Sonny Rollins or Bill Evans. Okay, so there's something going in here. I don't think I'm completely wrong. Let's put it that way. But enchantment is not anti-modernist. It simply walks a different road. It's non-modern. Enchantment is not an anti-modernist, not a post-modernist or a pre-modernist. It's a non-modernist experience. That's why paid-up card-carrying modernists are deeply suspicious of it, because it calls into question their project and how far you can carry that project. I think that insofar as we are spiritual and material beings, I hope nobody minds if I call us the human animal, which I would defend as a term and as a concept. Enchantment is our birthright. You can never entirely rule it out. And as long as that's the case, then we will never be these perfect, complete, shiny, metallic, all-powerful beings that people like, say, the humanists want us to become. Yeah. So I said enchantment suspends time, but when it suspends time, it also suspends history. So you can be helped into an enchantment of a painting, say, by knowing what the artist was trying to do, its historical development and context, various movements of the time, and subsequently all the reasons why the painting now matters or doesn't matter. But when you are enchanted, when it's worked, when it's taken, all that vanishes. It'll come back later, but it's not present and it's not needed. Oddly enough, intellectuals don't like this idea. That they want to be needed 24/7, it seems. And they haven't taken to my suggestion that there's a point at which all that becomes irrelevant. And so even though perhaps rich modernists, very marketable modernists, may have divided up the artistic spoils, and painting itself, maybe say, oh, painting, I mean, so old hat. But at the moment that you find yourself, say, in a tiny painting by Samuel Palmer that glows with a sourceless inner light, coming home from church under a huge moon, doesn't matter. And there's maybe a tiny painting, but there's so much room in there. So, heading into the final straight, sorry to sniff, I don't have a handkerchief. I said earlier it's important to grant enchantment its distinctiveness. I don't I'm particularly, as part of that effort, I'm wary of inflating it to become somehow indistinguishable from all spiritual experience, all transcendent experience. I don't want to do that. So, for example, to draw one of the strongest possible contrasts, Jesus, according to John 4, verse 1 to 29, Jesus says to the woman at the well, quote, "Whoever shall drink of this water, the well, shall thirst again, but whosoever shall drink of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst." I have no problem with that, but I just want to point out that that's not enchantment. Enchantment always passes. You can't rule it out coming. You can't rule out the possibility that it comes back, and it very often does, or it may or may not, and it may be intensely meaningful when it does, but that is not a description of enchantment. Enchantment doesn't work like that. It does pass, okay, because of the concrete part of concrete magic. And I'm not sure that we should wish it was any other way. Here's a long quotation by somebody who knew a thing or two about it, Adam Zagajewski, the Polish essayist and poet who died not long ago. Quote, "It may not be such a good idea to dwell always exclusively in the spirit, in a state of unvarying exaltation, rapture, with no experience of emptiness, melancholy, or even despair. Living in the spirit only now and then is doubtless difficult, distressing, and restless, but it may also be more creative. You enter the spirit only briefly, but with the passion, joy, and energy that accompany any meeting after a long absence, a prolonged separation. And you depart immediately, sorrow, regret, perhaps even with the mistaken, or mostly mistaken, impression that you'll never return. This would mean that less is more, that retrieving the spirit only every so often, for all the pain of parting, is more fruitful than taking up permanent residence in rapture." Now, I'm not sure permanent residence in rapture is actually an option for us, but let that pass. Since the person living in a palace is less likely to admire and describe it than the modest visitor, well-worn suitcase in hand, to whom the master grants a brief stay before sending him on his way. That way may lead to the next palace, but not immediately. He must cover a long, gray, dusty road, what Tolkien called the gray and leafless world, disenchantment, what the Chinese masters called the dry and dusty world, okay? Before catching sight of the next splendid edifice, whose master will once more open the gates for our traveler, and each time he leaves one of those wondrous dwellings, he misses it. And in his longing, he sees once again, more clearly what precisely he has lost. And he'll live in that longing, which seems to be the form best suited to our existence. Very wise words, I think. I don't want to add too much. I'll close by saying, I think this is a kind of, that enchantment points to and embodies a kind of truth that we have not been well trained or prepared to recognize. It's not unchanging, it's not permanent, it's not single or universal, but it is rooted in our nature as natural beings, neither pure spirits nor pure matter, as usually conceived to be, but human beings who are themselves concrete magic, spiritual to be sure, but also embodied and embedded in ecological beings. It's as human beings in that sense that we need art and can love art and learn from art. And that's what art can do, I think, in the end. Take us into the heart of where and when and who we already are and remind us of its wonder. Thank you.